Susan Miller wiped sweat from her brow as she mopped the stage floor of the Morgan Theater. The clock on the wall showed 11:30 p.m. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, but Susan always stayed late to make sure everything was perfect for tomorrow's rehearsal. At 32 years old, she had been working as a janitor at the theater for nearly 5 years now. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and gave her something else. Something she treasured more than money. The theater, lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the empty seats. Susan looked around to make sure she was truly alone, then set her mop against the wall. She took a deep breath and walked to the center of the stage. This was her nightly ritual, her secret joy. Susan closed her eyes and began to sing. Her voice started soft, almost a whisper, but grew stronger with each note. The sound filled the empty theater, bouncing off the walls and ceiling, creating a natural echo that made it seem like a chorus of voices instead of just one woman. She sang an aria from Mozart's The Magic Flute, one she had heard the theater's star soprano practice dozens of times. But in Susan's voice, the difficult notes seemed effortless, flowing like water. In her mind, she wasn't a janitor in a gray uniform. She was dressed in a beautiful gown, singing to a packed house that hung on her every note. This dream had kept her going through years of cleaning toilets and emptying trash cans. Susan had grown up in a small town outside of Nashville, where her father worked at a gas station and her mother waited tables at the local diner. They weren't poor, but there was never extra money for things like singing lessons or college. Still, music had always been in her blood. As a child, she would sing while doing chores, her voice bringing a smile to her tired mother's face. "You got a gift, Susie," her mother would say. "Don't you let it go to waste." But life had a way of pushing dreams aside. After high school, Susan needed to work. She moved to the city, took what job she could find, and eventually landed at the Morgan Theater. It wasn't singing on stage, but at least she was close to the music she loved. As Susan reached the most difficult part of the aria, the famous high F notes that had defeated many professional singers, her voice soared clear and true. Her eyes remained closed, lost in the music, unaware that she was no longer alone. Paul Harris, the theater's stage manager, stood frozen in the back doorway. He had forgotten his car keys and returned to find them, only to be stopped in his tracks by what he was hearing. Paul had worked in opera for 20 years. He had heard the greatest sopranos in the world perform, but the voice coming from this cleaning woman made his hair stand on end. Susan finished the aria with perfect control, holding the final note until it faded naturally into silence. When she opened her eyes, the spell was broken. She was just a janitor again, standing on a half-mopped stage. Paul ducked back into the shadows before she could see him. His mind raced. How was it possible that this woman, this nobody, could sing like that? And more importantly, what should he do about it? The next morning, Susan arrived at the theater as usual, this time to clean the lobby before the day's rehearsals began. She nodded politely to the actors and musicians who passed her, most of whom didn't even notice her. She was part of the background, like the furniture or the walls. Nancy Wells swept through the front doors at 9:45, 15 minutes late as usual. The theater's lead soprano wore large sunglasses and a fur coat despite the mild weather. Two assistants trailed behind her, one carrying her coffee, the other her sheet music. "It's freezing in here again," Nancy complained loudly to no one in particular. "How am I supposed to warm up my voice in a refrigerator?" Susan kept her head down and continued wiping the glass display cases. She had learned long ago that becoming invisible was the best way to avoid Nancy's sharp tongue. Richard Green, the theater director, hurried out to greet his star. "Nancy, darling, you look radiant this morning. We've turned the heat up just for you." Nancy removed her sunglasses with a dramatic flourish. "The ticket sales for next month, Richard. I've heard they're disappointing." Richard's smile faltered. "Well, yes, a bit slower than we'd hoped, but I told you we should have done Carmen instead of this tired old Mozart piece," Nancy cut in. "No one wants to see the magic flute for the 100th time." Their voices faded as they walked toward the rehearsal room, but Susan caught the worry in Richard's expression. The theater had been struggling financially for months. Everyone knew it, even the cleaning staff. There had already been whispers about budget cuts and layoffs. During lunch break, Susan sat alone on a bench outside the theater, eating the sandwich she had packed that morning. From her spot, she could hear Nancy practicing through an open window. The soprano was having trouble with the Queen of the Night aria, the same one Susan had sung perfectly the night before. Nancy's voice strained on the high notes, occasionally breaking. "Again!" came Richard's voice after a particularly rough attempt. Susan winced as Nancy tried once more, missing the mark by a sharp half note. Susan hummed the correct pitch under her breath, then caught herself and stopped. It wasn't her place to judge. These were professionals. She was just a woman with a mop. Later that afternoon, Susan was cleaning the bathrooms when she overheard Paul talking to Mary Johnson, the costume designer. "I'm telling you, Mary, it was unbelievable," Paul whispered urgently. "I've never heard anything like it. This janitor, Susan, she was singing the Queen's aria after hours, and I swear she hit every note perfectly. Better than Nancy ever has." "Oh, come on," Mary said skeptically. "Our Susan? The quiet one who never talks to anyone?" "I couldn't believe it either," Paul insisted. "But I know what I heard." Susan's heart pounded in her chest. Someone had heard her. Her private moment, her secret joy, wasn't so secret anymore. She backed, away from the door, accidentally knocking over her cleaning cart with a loud crash. The conversation stopped immediately. Susan scrambled to pick up the fallen supplies, her face burning with embarrassment. Mary poked her head out of the room. "Susan, are you okay out here?" "Fine, just clumsy," Susan mumbled, not meeting Mary's eyes. Mary stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind her. She was a kind woman in her 50s who had always treated the support staff with respect. "Susan, dear, Paul was just telling me something interesting about you." Susan froze, a bottle of cleaning spray clutched in her hand. "I'm sorry for using the stage after hours. I know I shouldn't—" No, Mary interrupted gently. "That's not what this is about. Paul says you can sing. Really sing." Susan stared at the floor. "It's just something I do for fun. It's nothing, really." Mary put a hand on Susan's shoulder. "From what Paul described, it's definitely not nothing. Why have you kept this talent hidden?" Susan shrugged. "Who would care if a janitor could sing? This isn't a fairy tale, Ms. Johnson." "Maybe not," Mary said thoughtfully, "but it might be more of one than you think." Neither of them noticed Nancy Wells standing at the end of the hallway, listening to every word with narrowed eyes and a calculating expression on her face. That night, Susan didn't sing. She cleaned the theater quickly and left early, afraid that Paul or someone else might be listening. As she walked to the bus stop, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear that her private world had been invaded, but also a tiny flicker of something else. Hope, perhaps. For the first time in years, someone knew about her voice. Someone had heard her sing. She didn't know yet if that was a good thing or a very, very bad one. The next morning, Susan arrived at the Morgan Theater earlier than usual. She hoped to finish her cleaning before the rest of the staff arrived, still embarrassed that Paul had heard her singing. As she polished the brass railings in the lobby, she heard voices coming from the director's office. The door was slightly open and Nancy's sharp tone cut through the quiet morning air. "Ticket sales are down 30%, Richard. We need something to bring people in," Nancy said. "I'm open to suggestions," Richard replied, his voice tired. "The board is breathing down my neck about costs." Susan didn't mean to eavesdrop, but Nancy's next words made her freeze in place. "I have the perfect publicity stunt," Nancy said with a smile in her voice. "Let's have a staff talent show, open to everyone who works here, from musicians to maintenance." There was a pause before Richard answered. "A talent show? I don't see how that helps us." "Trust me," Nancy insisted. "We'll invite local press. It's a human interest story, the people behind the scenes getting their moment in the spotlight. The community will eat it up." Susan's stomach tightened. She knew exactly what Nancy was planning. Paul must have told others about her singing, and word had reached Nancy. This wasn't about community spirit, this was about humiliation. "Fine," Richard sighed. "Set it up for next Friday. But this better bring in some interest, Nancy. Susan quickly moved away from the door as Nancy exited, a triumphant smile on her perfectly made-up face. When Nancy spotted Susan with her cleaning supplies, her smile widened. "Oh, Susan, just the person I wanted to see," Nancy said sweetly. "We're having a staff talent show next Friday. Everyone's participating, even you." Susan looked down at her cleaning rag. "I don't think—" "It wasn't a request," Nancy cut in, her voice suddenly cold. "Richard says all staff must participate. It's in your contract to support theater events." This was a lie, but Susan didn't know enough about her contract to argue. Nancy walked away, leaving Susan standing alone with her fears. Throughout the day word spread about the talent show. Posters appeared on bulletin boards. Morgan Theater Staff Showcase. Discover the hidden talents among us. At the bottom was a sign-up sheet that already had Susan's name on it, written in Nancy's elegant handwriting. During her lunch break, Susan sat in her usual spot behind the theater. Mary Johnson found her there, concern etched on her kind face. "Susan, I heard about the talent show," Mary said, sitting down beside her. "Paul told me he mentioned your singing to a few people. He didn't mean any harm." Susan wrapped her sandwich, back in its paper. Her appetite was gone. "Nancy put my name on the list. She wants me to sing." Mary's eyes widened. "But that's wonderful. Everyone should hear your voice." "No, it's not wonderful," Susan replied quietly. "She wants me to fail, to look foolish in front of everyone. She's the star here. She doesn't want competition, especially from someone who cleans toilets." Mary was quiet for a moment. "What will you sing?" "Something simple. A folk song my mother taught me. Nothing fancy." Mary nodded thoughtfully. "That's probably best. Nancy expects you to try something difficult and mess it up. Just sing your little song and she'll be disappointed it wasn't a bigger disaster." Susan gave a weak smile. "That's the plan." The days leading up to the talent show passed quickly. Susan practiced her folk song at home in her small apartment, keeping her voice soft so her neighbors wouldn't hear through the thin walls. It was a simple melody about mountains and valleys, nothing like the complex opera pieces she loved. But it was safe. On Friday evening, Susan arrived at the theater with her heart pounding. She wore her best clothes, a plain blue dress she had bought on sale 2 years ago for her cousin's wedding. It wasn't fancy, but it was better than her gray work uniform. To her surprise, the theater was packed. She had expected a few staff members and maybe some family, but there must have been 300 people in the audience. She spotted cameras and reporters in the front row. Nancy had indeed made this a big event. Backstage was chaos. Technicians were performing magic tricks, dancers were stretching, and musicians were tuning instruments. Everyone was participating, even Richard, who planned to recite Shakespeare. Paul found Susan hiding in a corner. "There you are. You're on after Richard's monologue." He handed her a program. Her name was last on the list. "Break a leg," Paul said with an encouraging smile. "Just pretend no one's watching, like when you sing after hours." Susan nodded, clutching the sheet music for her folk song. Her hands were sweating, leaving damp marks on the paper. The show began. Act after act took the stage, some talented, some amusingly bad. The audience clapped politely for everyone. Richard performed his Shakespeare with dramatic flair, and then it was Susan's turn. As she walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinded her. She could hear whispers in the audience. "That's the janitor, isn't it? What's she going to do?" Susan handed her sheet music to the pianist, a young man named Steve who had always been kind to her. But before he could take it, Nancy appeared. From the wings, microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nancy announced, her voice silky smooth. "Our final performer tonight is Susan Miller, who has been keeping our theater spotless for 5 years." The audience applauded politely. Susan tried to smile, but her face felt frozen. "I've been told that our Susan has a secret talent," Nancy continued. "She apparently believes she can sing opera." Susan's heart sank. This wasn't part of the plan. So, instead of the little folk song she's prepared, Nancy said, taking the sheet music from Susan's hand and replacing it with different papers, I think we should hear her attempt something more appropriate for our venue. Susan looked down at the new music in her hands. It was the Queen of the Night aria from the Magic Flute, the most difficult soprano piece in all of opera. The same piece Nancy herself had been struggling with. In rehearsals, "Oh, I can't," Susan began, but Nancy had already handed the new music to Steve and was walking off stage with a satisfied smirk. "Good luck," Nancy whispered as she passed. "Don't worry. Everyone loves a good train wreck." Susan stood frozen in the spotlight, clutching the complex score. The audience waited expectantly. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, could sense the curiosity and the anticipation of failure. Steve looked up at her from the piano, concern in his eyes. "We don't have to do this one," he whispered. "I can still play your folk song." Susan glanced toward the wings. Nancy stood watching, arms crossed, a triumphant smile on her face. Behind her, other cast members gathered, some looking uncomfortable at the obvious setup, others curious to see what would happen. Mary Johnson caught Susan's eye and gave an encouraging nod. Paul stood beside her, looking worried but hopeful. Something shifted inside Susan. For 5 years she had made herself small, had hidden her gift, had accepted her place in the shadows. Nancy expected her to run off stage in tears or to attempt the piece and fail miserably. Either way, Susan the janitor would be put back in her place, and everyone would have a good laugh at her expense. Susan took a deep breath and turned back to Steve. "Play it," she said quietly. "Are you sure?" he asked, surprised. Susan nodded. "Yes, from the beginning, please." Steve positioned his hands over the keys, gave her a quick count-in, and began to play the famous introduction. The complex, almost menacing melody filled the theater. Susan closed her eyes and took another deep breath. In this moment, she wasn't thinking about the audience or Nancy or what would happen tomorrow. She was thinking about her mother, who had always believed in her gift. She was thinking about all the nights she had spent singing alone on this very stage, pouring her heart into music no one was meant to hear. As the introduction ended and her entrance approached, Susan opened her eyes and began to sing. The first note that came from Susan's lips was soft, almost inaudible. In the wings, Nancy's smile grew wider. This was exactly what she had hoped for. The janitor would embarrass herself, and everyone would remember why Nancy Wells was the star of the Morgan Theater. But then something unexpected happened. Susan's second note was stronger. By the third, her voice had found its power. The aria began with a relatively simple melody, and Susan delivered it with a clarity that made several audience members sit up straighter in their seats. Steve, the pianist, glanced up at Susan in surprise but kept playing, his fingers dancing across the keys. In the audience, Richard Green leaned forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. This was not the voice of an amateur. As Susan continued, her confidence grew. The theater was completely silent except for her voice and the piano. Even the reporters, who had been scribbling notes throughout other performances, sat with pens frozen above their notepads. Nancy's smile began to fade. This wasn't going according to plan. The janitor was supposed to crack on the high notes, to run from the stage in tears. Instead, Susan was singing, really singing, with a control that Nancy herself struggled to achieve. The aria moved into its first difficult section. These were the passages that separated professionals from amateurs that had ended careers and broken voices. Susan took a deep breath and dove in. The coloratura, rapid runs of notes that twisted and turned like birds in flight, poured from her throat with effortless precision. Each note was perfect, each phrase shaped with artistic sensitivity that usually took years of training to develop. In the front row, an older gentleman with silver hair, a well-known music critic from the city paper, removed his glasses and wiped them, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing and hearing. Susan was no longer aware of the audience. She wasn't thinking about Nancy or the cruel trick that had been played on her. She was lost in the music, in the joy of finally singing with her whole heart in front of others instead of in an empty theater. The aria built toward its most famous section, the part with the impossibly high F notes that had defeated countless sopranos over the centuries. Susan approached it without fear. She had sung this passage hundreds of times alone on this very stage. Her body knew what to do. The first high F rang out like a bell, clear and true. The audience gasped collectively. Even those who knew nothing about opera could tell they were witnessing something extraordinary. The second high F was even better than the first, held just a fraction longer, with a slight shimmer that showed complete mastery of breath control. In the wings, Nancy's face had turned pale. Paul and Mary exchanged looks of pure amazement. Other performers crowded around, mouths open in shock. The aria continued, growing more intense with each phrase. Susan's voice soared higher and higher, filling every corner of the theater with sound that seemed almost superhuman in its beauty and power. When she reached the final section, with its dramatic runs leading to a triumphant conclusion, the audience was completely under her spell. As the last note faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Susan opened her eyes, suddenly aware again of where she was and what she had done. For a terrible second she thought she had failed, that everyone was too shocked by her audacity to respond. Then the theater erupted. People leaped to their feet, applauding wildly. Cheers and whistles echoed off the walls. In the front row, the silver-haired critic was standing on his chair shouting "Brava, brava" at the top of his lungs. Susan stood frozen in place, overwhelmed by the response. Steve, the pianist, had risen from his bench and was clapping as hard as everyone else, beaming up at her with pure joy. In the wings, the reaction was just as intense. Performers who had worked at the greatest opera houses in the world were wiping tears from their eyes. Paul was jumping up and down like a child. Mary was sobbing openly, her hands pressed to her heart. Only Nancy remained still, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. The janitor hadn't just done well, she had delivered a performance for the ages. Richard Green pushed past Nancy and ran onto the stage. He took Susan's hand and raised it high, like a boxing referee declaring a champion. The audience roared even louder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard shouted over the noise, "Susan Miller." The applause continued for nearly 5 minutes. People stomped their feet and called for an encore. Reporters were on their phones calling their editors about the incredible story unfolding at the Morgan Theater. When the noise finally began to die down, Richard leaned close to Susan's ear. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" he whispered, still holding her hand. Susan shook her head, dazed by the response. "I never had lessons," she said. "I just listened and practiced when no one was around." Richard stared at her in amazement. "No lessons? That's impossible. You just gave the best performance of the Queen of the Night I've ever heard." Susan didn't know how to respond. This didn't feel real. Just hours ago, she had been mopping the theater floor. Now people were treating her like a star. As Richard led her off stage, reporters surged forward, calling her name and snapping photos. The flash of cameras blinded her momentarily. "Ms. Miller, how long have you been hiding this talent?" "Susan, will you be auditioning for the opera now?" "Where did you train? Europe, Juilliard?" Paul and Mary rushed to Susan's side, creating a protective barrier between her and the press. Mary wrapped her arm around Susan's shoulders and guided her toward the dressing rooms. "Give her some space," Paul told the reporters. "She'll answer questions later." In the hallway, they passed Nancy, who stood against the wall as if she had been frozen in place. Her face was a mixture of emotions, shock, anger, and something that might have been fear. Susan had just done what Nancy couldn't do, sung the most difficult aria in opera flawlessly, without years of expensive training or powerful connections. "I think you owe Susan an apology," Mary said coldly as they passed. Nancy said nothing, her eyes fixed on Susan with a new awareness. The janitor who had been invisible to her for 5 years had suddenly become the most visible person in the theater. In the small dressing room normally reserved for visiting soloists, Susan sat down heavily on a velvet chair. Her legs were shaking, her heart racing. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and saw the same person she had always been. Plain features, simple blue dress, hair pulled back in a practical style. But something in her eyes had changed. There was a light there that hadn't been visible before. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Paul and Mary exchanged glances. "Now," Paul said with a gentle smile, "everything changes." There was a knock at the door. Richard entered, followed by an elegant older woman Susan had never seen before. "Susan," Richard said, his voice filled with excitement. "This is Eleanor Benton, the artistic director of the National Opera." She was in the audience. "Tonight." Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Susan's face. "My dear," she said warmly, "I believe we have a great deal to discuss about your future." Behind them, in the doorway, other performers and staff members had gathered, all trying to catch a glimpse of the woman who had just become the talk of the city. Among them was Steve, the pianist, who gave Susan a thumbs up and a wide grin. Susan took a deep breath. Just hours ago, her greatest fear had been public humiliation. Nancy had tried to destroy her with the most difficult piece in all of opera. Instead, that very piece had revealed her true self to the world. For the first time in her life, Susan Miller was no longer invisible. The next morning, Susan woke up in her small apartment and wondered if she had dreamed the whole thing. But the pile of business cards on her kitchen table proved it had been real. Music directors, agents, reporters, all had pressed their cards into her hands the night before, begging for interviews or auditions. Her phone rang. It had been ringing non-stop since she got home, but she had been too overwhelmed to answer. This time she picked up. "Hello? Susan, it's Mary. Have you seen the papers?" Susan looked at the clock. It was only 7:30 a.m. "No, I just woke up. There's someone outside your building selling them. You should go get one." Curious, Susan threw on a jacket over her pajamas and went downstairs. Sure enough, a newspaper vendor had set up right outside her apartment building, something that had never happened before. When he saw her, his eyes widened. "Hey, you're her, the singing janitor." He thrust a paper toward her. "On the house, miss." Susan took the newspaper with trembling hands. There she was on the front page, mouth open in song, eyes closed in concentration. The headline read, "Cinderella Story, Theater Janitor Reveals World-Class Voice." The article described her performance in glowing terms. The critic with silver hair, whose name was Edward Winters, called her a once-in-a-generation talent and wrote that her performance of the Queen of the Night aria was perhaps the finest this reviewer has heard in 40 years of attending opera. Susan leaned against the wall of her building, trying to take it all in. Just 24 hours ago, she had been mopping floors and emptying trash cans. Now her face was on the front page of the city's biggest newspaper. Her phone rang again. This time it was Richard Green. "Susan, we need you at the theater right away. The place is swarming with press and Eleanor Benton is here with a contract." "A contract?" Susan asked, confused. "Yes, for the National Opera's upcoming season. And there are other offers coming in as well. We need to talk about your future." Susan looked down at herself, old pajamas under a threadbare jacket. "I need to get dressed. Send me your address. I'll send a car. 30 minutes later, Susan sat in the back of a sleek black car, wearing the same blue dress from the night before, the only nice outfit she owned. The driver kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "My wife and I were there last night," he finally said. "Never heard anything like it in my life." Susan smiled shyly. "Thank you. You gonna quit being a janitor now?" It was a question Susan hadn't even had time to consider. Would the theater let her keep her job if she said no to these offers? Did she want to keep her job? When they arrived at the Morgan Theater, a crowd had gathered outside. People held up phones to take her picture as she hurried through the doors. Inside, the lobby was filled with reporters, cameras, and important-looking people in expensive suits. Richard spotted her and rushed over. "Thank God you're here. Everyone wants to talk to you." He led her to his office, where Eleanor Benton sat with a stack of papers in front of her. Paul and Mary were there too, along with a man in a pinstriped suit who was introduced as Alan Peters, an entertainment lawyer. The theater has asked me to represent you until you find permanent management, Alan explained. Pro bono, of course. We want to make sure no one takes advantage of you. Eleanor pushed the contract across the desk. We want Susan to debut as the Queen of the Night in our summer production. Full principal soprano salary, of course. Alan picked up the contract and began reading it carefully. We'll need to discuss terms. Susan's head was spinning. This is all happening so fast. Mary put a comforting hand on her shoulder. You don't have to decide anything right now. Actually, Richard cut in, there is some time pressure. The National wants to announce Susan as their new discovery at a press conference this afternoon. And the Morgan Theater, Susan asked. What happens to my job here? Richard looked uncomfortable. Well, we assumed, that is, we thought you wouldn't want. What Richard is trying to say, Paul explained gently, is that most people don't continue working as janitors after becoming opera stars. Susan nodded slowly. It made sense, of course. But cleaning the Morgan had been her life. For 5 years. The thought of never mopping its stage again made her strangely sad. There was a knock at the door. A young assistant poked her head in. Mr. Green, Nancy Wells is insisting on speaking with you. She says it's urgent. Richard sighed. Tell her, I'm in a meeting. She's threatening to quit if you don't see her right now. Eleanor Benton raised an eyebrow. Nancy Wells, isn't she your current Queen of the Night? Yes, Richard admitted. And she's been difficult since last night. Send her in, Susan said suddenly. Everyone looked at her in surprise. I want to talk to her. Richard hesitated, then nodded to the assistant. A moment later, Nancy swept into the office, immaculately dressed as always. She stopped short when she saw the gathering. I didn't realize this was a party, she said coldly. Her eyes landed on Susan and her expression hardened. I need to speak with Richard privately. Anything you have to say can be said in front of everyone, Richard replied. Nancy lifted her chin. Fine. I'm exercising the out clause in my contract. I refuse to be associated with a theater that promotes untrained talent. The word untrained dripped with disdain. Susan felt her cheeks grow hot, but she kept her expression neutral. Eleanor Benton stood up. Ms. Wells, I presume? I'm Eleanor Benton, Artistic Director of the National Opera. Nancy's eyes widened slightly. Ms. Benton, I wasn't aware you were in town. I was in the audience last night, Eleanor said. What a remarkable coincidence that you chose that particular aria for Ms. Miller to perform. Almost as if you knew her capabilities. Nancy flushed. I had no idea she could sing it. It was meant to be a joke. The room went silent. Nancy seemed to realize what she had admitted and pressed her lips together tightly. Susan stood up. Nancy, can we talk alone for a moment? After a brief hesitation, Nancy nodded stiffly. They stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind them. I want to thank you, Susan said quietly. Nancy blinked in confusion. Thank me? For what? Trying to humiliate you? Yes, Susan replied simply. If you hadn't forced me to sing that aria, I would have performed a little folk song, and no one would have noticed me. I would still be invisible. Nancy stared at her, clearly unsure how to respond to gratitude instead of anger. You don't have to leave the Morgan, Susan continued. I'm not trying to take your place. Nancy gave a short, bitter laugh. You already have. Did you see the review? Edward Winters called you the finest queen he's ever heard. He's called me adequate for years. Susan hadn't considered how the reviews would affect Nancy. Despite everything, she felt a pang of sympathy for the woman who had tried to destroy her. There are other roles, Susan offered. Other operas. Not for me, Nancy said quietly. A rare moment of vulnerability breaking through her hard exterior. I've been playing younger roles for years already. Sopranos my age are usually put out to pasture. The Queen was my last chance to stay relevant. Susan was silent for a moment. Then she had an idea. What if we shared it? Nancy looked at her like she had suggested they fly to the moon. Shared a role? That's not how it works. Why not? We could alternate performances. The publicity would be huge. The established star and the discovered janitor, performing the same role on different nights. Nancy's eyes narrowed as she considered this. Susan could almost see the calculations happening behind them. The press would love it, she admitted reluctantly. And, Susan added, you could help me. I've never had a single lesson. I don't know how to read music properly. I don't know anything about performing professionally. This appeal to Nancy's expertise worked. Her posture straightened, and a hint of her usual confidence returned. You do need training. Your breathing technique is instinctive but inconsistent, and your Italian pronunciation needs work. Susan smiled. See? We could help each other. Nancy studied her for a long moment. Why are you being kind to me after what I did? Susan thought about it. Because I know what it's like to be afraid of losing the one thing that matters to you. For you, it's being a star. For me, it was keeping my voice a secret. Something passed between the two women, not quite friendship but understanding. Nancy nodded once, then turned and walked back into the office with her head held high. Susan followed, aware that her life had changed forever, but determined to face her new future with the same quiet strength that had sustained her through years of invisibility. And this time, she wouldn't be singing alone. 6 months had passed since the night that changed Susan Miller's life forever. The small calendar on her dressing room wall had a red circle around today's date. It was opening night at the National Opera, and Susan would make her professional debut as the Queen of the Night. The dressing room was much fancier than anything Susan had known before. Fresh flowers sat on the vanity. Costumes hung neatly on a rack. Cards and small gifts from well-wishers covered every surface. She sat quietly, staring at her reflection in the mirror as a makeup artist worked on her face. Susan barely recognized herself anymore. The plain janitor was gone, replaced by someone who looked like a proper opera singer. Her hair was styled elegantly. Her posture had changed from years of slouching with a mop to the straight-backed confidence of a performer. But inside, she sometimes still felt like the woman who used to clean this very theater. There was a knock at the door. 15 minutes, Ms. Miller, called a stagehand. The makeup artist made a few final touches and left. Susan was alone with her thoughts and the butterflies in her stomach. The past 6 months had been the most intense of her life. Voice lessons every day, language coaching, acting classes, movement training. She had absorbed it all like a sponge, making up for years of lost time. Nancy Wells had surprised everyone by keeping her word. 3 days a week, she had personally coached Susan, teaching her the finer points of professional singing. Their relationship wasn't exactly friendship, but it had grown into a respectful partnership. They would alternate performances throughout the run. Nancy on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Susan on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays. Tonight was Friday, Susan's night. Another knock came at the door. This time it was Eleanor Benton, the artistic director who had taken a chance on an untrained janitor. "How are you feeling?" Eleanor asked, entering the dressing room. "Nervous," Susan admitted. "What if I forget the words? What if I trip on my costume? What if my voice cracks on the high F?" Eleanor smiled kindly. "Every singer feels this way before a debut, but you've done the work. You're ready." Susan nodded, trying to believe it. She had certainly put in the hours. Even Richard Green had commented on her dedication during the rehearsal period. "Most natural talents rest on their gifts," he had said. "You work harder than anyone." "There's someone here to see you," Eleanor said. I told her it's not standard protocol before a performance, but she was quite insistent. Susan looked up, expecting to see Mary or Paul. Instead, Nancy Wells walked in, already in full costume and makeup for her performance the next night. Eleanor quietly excused herself, leaving the two sopranos alone. "I just wanted to wish you luck," Nancy said, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "Thank you," Susan replied, genuinely touched. "For everything. I wouldn't be here without your help." Nancy waved this away. you would have been discovered. Eventually, someone with your voice couldn't stay hidden forever. Susan wasn't so sure. Without Nancy's cruel trick that had backfired so spectacularly, she might still be mopping floors and singing only when the theater was empty. The house is sold out, Nancy continued. Every performance for the entire run. The publicity worked better than anyone expected. The story of the janitor turned soprano had captured people's imagination. Newspapers and magazines had run feature stories. Television crews had followed Susan's transformation. The public couldn't get enough of the real-life fairy tale. Any advice for tonight? Susan asked. Nancy considered this. Remember to breathe. The third high F is the one most likely to give you trouble. Approach it from above, not below. And... She paused, looking almost embarrassed. Enjoy it. The first time is special. With that, Nancy nodded briskly and left the room. Susan stared after her, realizing how much had changed between them. The woman who had once tried to humiliate her had become her most demanding and effective teacher. The final knock came. 5 minutes to places, Ms. Miller. Susan stood up, smoothing the elaborate costume. The Queen of the Night wore a dark blue gown covered in stars with a magnificent crown. She looked regal and powerful, nothing like a woman who used to clean toilets. As she walked toward the stage, Susan passed familiar faces. The technical crew, many of whom she had worked alongside as a janitor, gave her thumbs up and whispered encouragement. Paul and Mary waited in the wings, both dressed in their finest clothes for her big night. You look amazing, Mary said, hugging her carefully to avoid disturbing the costume. The crew left something for you, Paul added, pointing to a small table just off stage. On it sat a simple gray mop, the same one Susan had used for years. Attached was a card signed by every member of the cleaning staff. It read, "Never forget where you came from. We're all proud of you." Susan felt tears, threatening to ruin her perfect makeup. She touched the mop gently, then squared her shoulders and took her position in the wings. The overture began, the familiar notes washing over her. She closed her eyes and let the music fill her body. When her cue came, she would step onto the stage as the Queen of the Night, fierce, powerful, and impossible to ignore. In the audience, several special guests waited. Susan's parents had flown in from Nashville, still in shock that their daughter had become an opera star. Edward Winters, the critic who had first recognized her gift, sat in his usual seat, pen poised to record this historic debut. Eleanor Benton watched from the director's box, confident in her decision to take a chance on an untrained voice. And in the very back row sat Steve, the kind pianist who had played for Susan on that fateful night. He had requested that seat specifically, wanting to hear how her voice would sound to someone entering the theater for the first time, someone discovering Susan Miller's gift just as he had 6 months ago. The Queen of the Night didn't appear until the second act, so Susan had time to settle her nerves. She watched the first act from the wings, admiring the other singers, all classically trained professionals who had welcomed her into their world with varying degrees of curiosity and respect. When intermission came, Richard found her. "The energy out there is electric," he told her. "Everyone's waiting for your aria." The 15-minute break passed in a blur, and suddenly it was time. The second act began. Susan took her position and waited for her entrance. The moment arrived. The orchestral introduction to her aria started. Susan took one deep breath, thought of all the nights she had sung alone on an empty stage, and stepped into the spotlight. Later, she wouldn't remember much about the performance itself. It passed in a kind of dream state, her body and voice doing what they had been trained to do while her mind floated somewhere above, watching in wonder. She hit every note perfectly, including all 3 high Fs. Her acting was convincing, her presence commanding. When the aria ended, the audience erupted in applause that stopped the show for nearly 5 minutes. By the time the final curtain fell, Susan was exhausted but exhilarated. The standing ovation seemed to go on forever. Flowers rained onto the stage. She took bow after bow, smiling until her face hurt. Backstage was chaos, well-wishers, flowers, congratulations from fellow performers. Her parents hugged her, tears streaming down their faces. "Your mother always said you had a gift," her father kept repeating, his voice choked with emotion. Hours later, when the theater had emptied and the excitement had died down, Susan found herself alone on the stage again. She had asked for a few minutes of privacy before leaving, needing to process everything that had happened. She walked to center stage, the place where she had stood so many times with a mop in her hands, dreaming impossible dreams. Now those dreams had come true in ways she could never have imagined. Susan looked out at the empty seats, remembering how it felt to sing when no one was listening. Then she recalled the faces of tonight's audience, moved, amazed, transformed by her voice. Both experiences were precious to her in different ways. She began to sing softly, not an opera aria this time, but the simple folk song she had originally planned to perform at the talent show. Its gentle melody filled the quiet theater, a reminder of her journey and a promise to never forget where she came from, no matter how far her voice might take her. As the last note faded away, Susan smiled to herself and whispered, "Thank you." She wasn't sure who she was thanking, Nancy for her unintended help, the theater for being her secret practice space for all those years, or simply life itself for its unexpected twists and turns. Then she turned and walked off stage, leaving, behind the cleaning supplies and shadows, stepping confidently into her new life, no longer invisible, no longer silent, but always, at heart, the same humble woman who had once been afraid to share her gift with the world.